I am Jason Scorse. I direct the Center for the Blue Economy. And the speaker series is mostly for our students in the program who are studying ocean coastal resource management, but also open to the public. And we are really excited to have Monique Fountain here. She's the director of the Tidal Wetland Program at Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. And we, as the center, have done some work with Elkhorn Slough. There's some, highway projects going on there because the Highway 1 is get inundated by sea level rise and storms. So there's some talk about that. We did some work on valuing the otters that live around the slough in Moss Landing. And we've really loved, for those of you in Monterey, please go check out the slough. It's an incredible, area of national biological significance, an incredible spot, both, the kind of inland biodiversity and then, out into the ocean right there and kind of the otters hanging out and everything. It's a great area. So Monique, we're super happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for the intro and the great intro to Elkhorn Slough. So thank you for inviting me to listen to this Building Resilience in California Coastal Salt Marsh. So I'll talk a lot about what's happening out at Elkhorn Slough. And so I'll cover where Elkhorn Slough Reserve is, what it is, project background. I was already talking about how we are building coastal resilience in the slough in an actual project. And then how we set the elevation, because that's something really important for climate change. And it's been an important component of the project. And then I'll go over some of our early results that are really focused around the lessons learned that are transferable to other areas and other projects. So just looking at the slough, where is Elkhorn Slough? It's here in the middle of Monterey Bay. It's a 7-mile-long coastal embayment emptying into the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And a large part of the slough is the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. And the reserve, actually, I think I'm going to turn my video off. I've had some bandwidth issues today, and I'm worried about losing that. So, okay, so the Elkhorn Slough is one of 29 sites throughout the nation, and it's designated to protect and study estuarine systems. And these were established through the Coastal Zone Management Act. And each reserve represents a partnership between NOAA and a state agency in that state. And let's see if I can get to my next slide here. There we go. Okay, so at Elkhorn Slough, the state agency is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and it owns and manages the slough, or the reserve. And as part of the NER, we are focused on place-based science with long-term monitoring used to inform management. So we monitor a lot and pull that together to inform how management of how the system is managed. And then the third partner at the reserve is the Elkhorn Slough Foundation. So the foundation is an accredited land trust conserving over 4,000 acres around the reserve and serving as the fiscal agent for the NER funding that comes in from NOAA. That's kind of our triangle partnership that creates the Elkhorn Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. So at the reserve, I'm going to give you a little bit of background of the reserve itself because it's a very interesting place. So there's 6 main programs. We have an education program, volunteer, coastal training, research, stewardship, and then the tidal wetland program, which is what I'm part of. So over 30,000 visitors come through and walk the trails every year. And our education program also manages the visitor center and the guided trail walks that we do. And then over 8,000 K through 12 and college kids explore the slough through field trips. And we also have this really nice microscope lab where they can get in and see all of the things that are swimming around in the water. It's really, really neat. And then we also do an array of community outreach events that are put on both on-site and off-site, although these days it's been more off-site. Our volunteer program supports every aspect of the work we do, and we would not be able to complete half of what we do without our amazing volunteers. They truly are out there getting everything done. It's really amazing. Coastal training program informs coastal decision makers, municipalities, local agencies, and environmental consultants through a number of different training opportunities. And then research is sort of two-pronged. There's the long-term monitoring that I mentioned, and that's meant to detect changes over time. And then there's short-term projects that are really focused on understanding some of the threats and reducing those threats to the slough habitats and the community. And then our stewardship program focuses on protecting and restoring habitats on the reserve. And our tidal wetland program, finally, focuses on conservation and restoration of the tidal wetlands of the slough. So all together, this big group and all these programs work together to really protect and conserve and restore the slough and get that message out. So now I'll focus on the project background and give you a bit of information on that. And so just to really start broadly, coastal wetlands are amazing places. They're very unique ecosystems. They're situated between terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And you'll hear the terms coastal wetland, salt marsh, and tidal wetland used interchangeably. So these tidal wetlands provide critical habitat for many creatures. In addition to providing food and shelter, they filter pollutants out of the water, and they also serve as an excellent carbon sink, which is really important in today's changing climate. But one of the things that makes them so fragile is that they exist in a very narrow elevation band. And this Goldilocks spot is where they get covered by saltwater often enough, but not too often. And because they're such amazing places, people have lived along their banks for centuries, taking advantage of all the rich food source that they provide. So this has led to some pretty serious impacts, and up to 50% of coastal wetlands have been lost in the past century. In California, about 85% of our vegetated tidal wetlands have been lost. So this brings us back to Elkhorn Slough. So here is an aerial view of the slough. So this is a Moss Landing Power Station, Highway 1, right through the middle here. And like other estuaries along the coast of California, Elkhorn Slough is a rich ecosystem with a diverse array of species and complex food webs. It's salicornia or pickleweed dominated. It doesn't have any spartina or coral grass, which is very common in San Francisco Bay and other estuaries. And portions of Elkhorn Slough are designated a Ramsar site, a marine protected area, state ecological reserve, wildlife management area. So all of these protections together are things that happen at different places at different times on different scales to help protect the slough. And it's also a really important stop on the Pacific Flyway for migratory birds. And so this unique environment also draws a lot of visitors to the slough, and it creates an economic engine driven by ecotourism, which Jason was mentioning, kind of alluding to earlier, some of the work that they've done. And it makes it really a high value system, both ecologically and economically. But it's really set in a working landscape with extensive historical modifications, such as the installation of the harbor in the 1940s, the diking and draining of wetlands, as well as future threats from climate change, especially sea level rise, which I'll talk quite a bit about today. So let's see here. This pretty much gives you a view of the slough from the front to the back, and a sense of the scale. All right, so looking back at the historic loss of salt marsh. So this picture here is the colors are true to form. This water is, blue is water, brown is mud, green is salt marsh. So this is the historic extent of salt marsh in Elkhorn Slough. And then moving forward to the year 2000, you can see how much of that marsh was lost. And a lot of that was due to the diking and draining of wetlands. So how do you tackle such an extensive change and turn this type of habitat loss around? So here in Elkhorn Slough, we have the Tidal Wetland Program. And there's basically 15 different agencies that have jurisdiction over the slough. And so they are our decision makers or our strategic planning team. And we want their decisions to be based on the best available science. So we have over 60 scientists from all different disciplines that come together and look at what the issues are, where the data is, and look at it from all these different angles. They identify data gaps and fill those gaps and then bring that information back to the decision makers. And so this information with our community stakeholders is what makes up the Tidal wetland program. And so we've done a number of things. We put together a strategic planning document that we then updated. And then we've done also some larger scale projects. So aside from planning, another aspect of the tidal wetland program is to actually raise funds and implement on the ground restoration projects. So that led to this project here, which is the Parsons Slough project, which was designed to reduce tidal scour in the estuary. And then the Whistle Stop project, which was a water quality improvement project. And then the project I'm talking about today, tidal marsh restoration through sediment addition. Okay, so this project that I'll be talking about is located in this part of the slough in the south edge. And for those of you that have been on the train going through the slough, that railroad goes right through here. Here's the railroad tracks, the main north-south Amtrak line. So looking back in time at that particular area, here's a 1931 overview. And this is all really healthy tidal marsh in here, even though it looks like it's just gray. I take my word for it. And then so this area had been diked and drained, and going forward to 2013, these dikes had failed. And so the tidal waters were coming back in. But the thing is when you dike and drain a wetland, it kind of shrinks up like a sponge. But when those dikes fail, it doesn't actually re-expand. You've lost that peat layer and that area has subsided or dropped. And so that's no longer high enough to support healthy tidal marsh and not really low enough to be a healthy mudflat. So looking at a little closer at what subsidence is, here it's that downward shift here. So here's your natural marsh plain. Put a dike in it, drive a tractor around on it, you get that subsidence. You don't have to drive a tractor. It can be animals. It can just be the fact that it's been diked that will have this impact. The dike is removed, but this area is then no longer high enough to support healthy tidal marsh, and you're left with just this bathtub ring around the outside. It's at the correct elevation to support healthy tidal marsh. So our particular goals for this project were to restore 130 acres of salt marsh ecosystem. And that's really from our coastal grasslands all the way at the top, all the way down through the subtidal channel network. And this represents about 12% of the tidal marsh left in the slough. So it can have a significant impact. Another goal was to protect and improve water quality through the filtering capacity of our restored marsh, reduce tidal scour in Elkhorn Slough, tidal scour is a scour caused by the tides moving in and out. And these areas here, so this is another look at the restoration area. When that area subsides, it creates this shallow basin which holds more water. So more water moving in and out of the slough creates tidal scour. Scours away the soft mud that's important for a lot of those invertebrates to live in. Another goal was increasing our understanding of blue carbon, and that is the carbon stored in coastal ecosystems, and improving southern sea otter habitat. So our largest concentration of sea otters, mothers and pups, live right in this area here. And our hope was that by creating more habitat right next to that they would be able to expand their range in that area, and then improving resilience to climate change, which in this case is sea level rise. So one of the first steps to restoring a resilient marsh is setting the elevation. So how high do you set that marsh? So if we look at this marsh, here's a cross section of a typical salt marsh. So we start at the top here. This is your upland where I have grasses and things like that. Then you go down through your marsh and your mud is at the bottom. So this is the distribution of plants that you might find along that gradient. And all of this is controlled by how much tidal overtopping you get. So the percent inundation throughout the year. And you can see that there's really not that much. Our high marshes are really around 1% tidal inundation. And so in order to set what we want, we know what a marsh looks like when it's too low. It's very patchy. The plants are not looking very healthy. We also know what a marsh looks like when it's set too high. When it's too high, it's basically a field of weeds. Here's the edge of the marsh plain right here. And so we chose to fill at this elevation just below 2 meters, and it allows for some construction tolerance. And so one of the questions I get is how long will this marsh last in the face of sea level rise? And I think one of the important things to remember is there's a lot of uncertainty in the models. So it's not really a question we can answer with great certainty, but we wanted to bring the marsh, we wanted to bring that elevation up as high in the tidal frame as possible, in the hope that the natural processes that help build marshes with sea level rise will start to function here. And so what I mean is that most of this marsh is inundated by tidal water only 1 to 2% of the time. So when the tides are overtopping that marsh, they're only the very highest tides and they're just about ready to turn around, which means that water is at slack tide and moving very slowly. This allows suspended sediment to drop out of suspension and onto the marsh, and that helps continue to build elevation. So the marsh goes up through it, the tides come over, the sediment drops out, and then the marsh continues to grow. And that's how a marsh gets elevation. And we want that to continue to happen. So that natural process has to happen. If we build a low marsh down here, the water moving over the top of it as the tide, if the tides go up to here, right, it's moving fast and that sediment doesn't fall out. So that's one of those natural processes we wanted to restore. And one of the important things about this and the reason we were so fixated on elevation is because you're putting tons and tons. We put in 230,000 cubic yards of soil on this marsh, and the weight of that new sediment is going to have an impact on all of these different layers. So you have your water here at the top, this slurry layer, which has a lot of water, plastic layer that we all get stuck in if we walk out in the marsh, and then the stiff layer that manages to hold us so we don't fall all the way down. And then some of these normally consolidated sediments that we just don't know how thick they are. And so all of this is compacting and compressing as we put the new soil on. And so there's a lot of different ways to get to this, but what we decided to do was to do basically a patch test or a pilot project in terms of just pushing material out there and then measuring it really closely and seeing how that compacted and then extrapolating that all over for the larger marsh area. So we didn't know what was happening in each individual layer, but we didn't need to. We were able to model it, put it into a model here and say, okay, here's our percent settlement over time, and hopefully that starts to level out. And this was work done by Ivano Ayala at the Moss Flanding Marine Labs. So our thought was, based on the modeling, that we would see about 5 to 10 centimeters of elevation loss over the life of the project. And that's, so our target elevation then is down here. And that's what we're monitoring, and I will be reporting on some of that today. So this is another perspective of that. Here, this is looking from the top down, and this is a digital elevation model, and it was done from a UAV or a drone. And again, the blue is water and the brown is mud and the green is marsh. And this is what our project looked like beforehand. This rust color around the outside here is really high marsh. So here's what it looks like. It's after the project. It gives you a sense that we're really bringing that entire marsh plain all the way up very high in the tidal frame. And a lot of that material came from this hillside. So you can see how this hillside contour was changed. I'm going to flip back to this original one. This was all the soil here. A lot of it was taken from here, contoured so that we actually have an area for marsh to migrate as sea level rises. And that was pretty nice. We published a paper on using the UAVs to study this. That was in Frontiers, and I think I have a link to share with you guys. So here's the project underway. It took about 9 months to move about 230,000 cubic yards of soil. And as I said, this was sourced from the hill side next to it, but it also came from a flood control project on the Pajaro River that's just to the north of Elkhorn Slough. And we were able to get some of that material and stage it and use it here instead of having it going into the landfill. But we were very happy about that. So all but the largest channels were filled and then re-excavated, as you can see this excavator is doing here. And our historical ecologist, Andrea Woolfolk, was able to reconstruct the historic channel network using using the maps that she had. And so we could actually figure out and see and recreate the historic channel network, which was really, really interesting. And then we were able to precisely create it because of the GPS on those tractors. So this excavator here had GPS on it so that they knew exactly what elevation both sides of that blade were, and they were able to cut an exact channel. So that was pretty exciting to be able to see this and to see this underway. So shortly after opening the project to the tides, wildlife started coming back in. First, fish that can swim fast and move fairly easily in, they came in, then the birds followed them. And also a lot of terrestrial animals such as bobcat, coyote. Let's see, there were raccoons and rabbits. And they really, it's amazing how much they came out and explored everything. Every night, it just seemed like there were animals came out and explored everything, looking for food, looking to see what was there, and left their tracks in the morning. I like this video. It's kind of Star Wars-ish, so I'll show a little bit more of it. It's amazing what you can do with drones. They just get right in there and get these just amazing images, video. All right, so here's what the project looked like from above, just after completion of the earth moving. And this is also a UAV photo. And in this is a historic channel network, and you can just see how intricate it was and how they were able to recreate it. And so once the soil was scraped from the hillside to rebuild the marsh, we had all this bare hillside. So I'll go over what we planted and what we didn't plant, and I'll start with what we didn't plant. So from past work at Elkhorn Slough, we had the expectation that if the elevation was correct, pickleweed would recruit. So we didn't plant any pickleweed in here, and other than just a few experimental plants. But we did plant what are called ecotone plants, which are in between right at the edge of the marsh and the grasslands. And we also planted grassland plants. So we did a big ecotone experiment here and some grasslands here. And I'll talk a little bit more about those. But basically, in terms of monitoring the site, since we finished it, we opened it up in August of 2018, August of 2018. So since then, we monitor about 23 different parameters, and we're measuring those. We're measuring both implementation, which is, did we build the marsh we intended to build? And we're also measuring ecological effectiveness. Is it functioning the way we intended it to function? So as I mentioned before, we've pretty much been pioneering the use of UAV or drones for much of the monitoring, and as this image is done from that, but we're also using more classical tools, such as the surface elevation tables, and we have 10 transects in there that we look at a number of things from percent cover to all the different below ground processes that are going on. And we're pairing these classical tools with the drone to make sure that we're getting the information we believe we're getting. We're sort of calibrating that drone imagery, because you get so much more with a drone. It really is amazing what you can see, instead of just sampling these small points of each place that we can actually get out there and measure. And we do have a detailed monitoring report on our website that if anybody's interested in that. So then I think I'll just cover like our early results, focused on what the lessons learned were. And I'll be talking about key physical elements, carbon sequestration, and our plant communities. So looking at the elevation changes, which I talked about in the beginning, this is another digital elevation model. And so this provides really detailed marsh elevation information. From the ranges here are 1.7 meters to 2.25 meters. And most of these color bins represent 4 millimeters of elevation change. So it allows us to really see the microtopography changes in here and what happens over time, and where all of those changes are happening. It's really, really remarkable. So in terms of looking at the overall marsh and how it dropped, so this is our vertical elevation change in centimeters. This is where we started when we opened. So when the tractors left, we started at this elevation, and we wanted to see how much it changed. So this is the days since the end of construction. So over time, you can see we have had that drop. We've had a really sharp drop. We've lost about 5 centimeters, 4.5, 5 centimeters. So we're within that 5 to 10 centimeter range that here's our initial elevation, but we're in that 5 to 10 centimeter range we were expecting. And what's interesting here is how much of it dropped really early in the beginning, right as it got overtopped for the first couple of times. And there's definitely some mechanics that go into that when the tides come back in and they inundate the soil, the dry soil. So basically, yeah, the results show that on average, the marsh dropped about 4.5, 5 centimeters in the first 2 years, and that most of this happened in the first couple months. And we'll be definitely monitoring this as time goes by. So our lesson learned in terms of constructability is that we can achieve a marsh plain elevation on soft soils. We can actually add material and get it up to an elevation that we're looking at. But what's important in this is understanding what the consolidation rates are. So if somebody's restoring a marsh, they have to understand what's happening underneath it before they can push material out. So we also did what's called a firm channel edge. And so we put in an edge of bay mud along here. And this is a technique that was used to stop this mud wave that we expected. So imagine you've got these tractors going out in this mud and pushing material across. You would expect to have a big mud wave moving across, and we wanted to stop it from going into the tidal channel. And this is a bit in the weeds, but the reason that I brought this up is because we put this mud channel in, and here's a picture of what it looks like. So here it is. It's compacted mud in here. We didn't actually have the mud wave. We didn't have to worry about that. It turned out it wasn't a problem. But this turned out to be great in so many other ways. It actually kept this bank from eroding. This bank on the other side eroded quite a bit more. And it also recruited in plants a lot better. So it's just kind of an example of you might do something for one reason, but you have to be really open to all the other benefits or other things that can happen as you go through. So we're actually using this in our phase 2 and phase 3 of the project, where there's a lot more wave energy since we know we can control erosion. So our lesson learned, firm channel edge of bay mud is an effective tool for reducing bank erosion. We also learned something else. This is another example kind of in that same vein, where constructing our tidal channels, natural tidal channels have really steep banks. But depending on the material that you use, what we found is we used a softer material, which was the material available, and we had some collapse, which led to some water quality issues. So what we learned is that we needed to slope those banks back. But an added benefit of that is that otters and seals like to haul out on shallower banks. So our lesson learned in terms of constructability was that it was important to slope those banks more than what maybe you might find in a natural bank, depending on what your fill material is. So carbon sequestration. So prior to starting the restoration, we sampled the 3 habitats that would be affected by the restoration. That was mud flats, salt marsh, and uplands. We resampled those habitats this last summer, and our early results suggest that there's a trade-off when you're creating high marsh. So building a high marsh that will have the greatest resilience to sea level rise in the long run leads to a slower rate of colonization. So here's what that looks like. So you've got a lot of pickleweed colonizing in these channels that are lower, but the water's not overtopping as much, and you're getting lower colonization rate up on the surface. And so I think, our blue carbon results are pretty early, but it does look like the higher marsh will take longer for these plants to recruit in and grow. And so that means that it'll take longer for that accompanying blue carbon sequestration to happen. And so, yeah, so our lesson learned, the trade-offs between maximizing current versus future blue carbon function. And that was a really interesting result I think we weren't quite expecting. So in terms of marsh recruitment, as I mentioned before, pickleweed is our most common marsh plant in our region. It arrives by seeds on the tide. It doesn't need planting, and it'll generally colonize and reach pretty high cover levels. And so starting in August, we were seeing just little bits here and there. By spring, we had some new recruits coming in. Then fall of 2019, we really had new plants that had grown and survived and were doing really well. But we had some interesting patterns in terms of where they were establishing. And there were some really dense patches right next to bare areas. And I mentioned before, there's more vegetation in the lower in the tidal creeks. And there is also at some of these really high elevations, which was interesting. And so again, based on prior research in Elkhorn Slough and other marshes, as well as our observations at this site, we think these vegetation patterns could be related to elevation, maybe proximity to tidal creeks. There's been a lot of different land use history in this area, so it could be whether or not it was a scraped levee or something like that. So lots of detailed questions. You know, it's always the devil is in the detail, but we're certainly considering how the sediment we brought in, different factors, physical and chemical, might be creating these patterns. So there's a lot to look at here. But I think in the long run, we expect that it shouldn't be a problem. So our lesson learned from marsh recruitment, if you build it, they will come. Well, sort of. We do believe it'll all fill in over time, but we're still working out what these various mechanisms of recruitment are and survival on the marsh plain. So our phase 2 has a big experiment because we think we might be seeing some drought impact. So we'll be doing some sprinkler experiments and looking at whether or not one of these issues is survivorship of some of those small recruiting marsh. So then the ecotone, we did a big ecotone experiment. These are rare plants that live in that transition zone or ecotone between marsh and the grasslands. And they're much slower to colonize naturally. So we collected their seeds, we grew them up in the greenhouse and grew a couple of different species, and also had the contractor grow some of them, and then started planting them. So the California Conservation Corps planted more than 16,000 marsh plants in just a few weeks. And that was a pretty amazing feat. It was actually pouring rain during that time. And one of the things we were looking at was whether or not there was any type of a refuge from environmental stress if you clustered them, or if it was really all about competition. So we planted plants uniformly. So we planted 9 plants in a cluster, or planted them, same 9 plants planted out, spread out. And that was, again, to see whether or not competition was a factor, or whether or not these plants nestled closer together would help avoid the environmental stress such as desiccation or herbivory. And so maybe there are positive interactions or negative interactions. And we did just a ton of plants out there. And so let's see here. This is what we did when we first planted them. This was April. And then by August, this is what we had. So this is the uniform. This is the clustered, same uniform pattern, and then clustered. So pictures worth 1,000 words. And it's pretty clear which one has the most above ground biomass and which one has the most empty space. And the thing is that, so this is basically, we're seeing that competition is a bigger factor than facilitation. And it's possible that when we planted these, it was a really wet year. So we aren't really seeing what that environmental stress is. So we're going to keep monitoring this to see if during these drought years, there's more protection from environmental stress. We'll be looking at that one. So basically our lesson learned for our Ecotone experiment is that after 3 years, competition appears more important than facilitation among these high marsh plants, since this greatest cover was achieved by widely spaced uniform planting rather than clustering. So again, a really interesting detail. And then I'll talk a little bit about the grassland restoration. And so where the sparrow area was, that was this section up in here. It's slowly being restored to a perennial native dominated grassland. And one of the things we tried were a number of different species and a number of different techniques. So hand seeding, tractor seeding, planting plugs, all these different variations to see what was going to work the best in our area. So again, almost 17,000 plugs were planted by our Conservation Corps staff and volunteers. We had a great public planting days where everybody got involved and did lots of seeding. We seeded about 100 pounds of locally sourced, produced native grass seeds. And that's a really important thing. All of our plants were locally sourced in our watershed. And here's an example of the seeded meadow barley from our first spring, which looks pretty awesome. But so that was, I showed you the best of the best, right? So, but in terms of what our lessons learned were for our upland planting, is that seeding was really the clear winner at establishing quick cover. So you put the seeds out there, they cover quickly, but those seeded areas are actually losing ground over time. And this could be due to our drought, we're not sure, but plugs have been slower to cover as much area, but they are definitely gaining ground over time. And the exception is this seeded gum plant, which started really strong and stayed really strong. And then the other thing, and actually I have this written out, so that's the seeding that was initially more successful. And the other thing was that these species from nearby reference sites have actually been the most successful. And so that comparison was, when people are doing these restorations, they say, oh, use this species, use California brome or use blue wild rye, and they're really great in restorations. But we found that the species that were nearby that did really well in our watershed were actually doing better than some of those species that folks said, oh yeah, do these, they're great. So again, everything we've done is written up in a restoration report. We update it annually. We have really fine details on the methods we use. If anybody is interested in that, what we do, what we've done and why we do it, what the questions we're asking and how it's being done. And this can be found on our website. And we did a couple of papers too on UAV and also on understanding the vegetation dynamics. And that, oh, that didn't come through. There it is. And that's all can be found on our elkhornslough.org website. So I've been talking primarily about phase 1 of the project, which is this area in here. And we're actually about 90% of the way through phase 2, which is up here. And we'll be starting phase 3, which is over here in about, by the end of the year. I always forget whether or not you can see my pointer. I hope you can. Okay, good. All right, so this will be over 120 acres restored, represents 12% of the tidal wetlands of Elkhorn Slough. We'll have 20 new acres of marsh in the scraped area and over 10 acres of perennial grasslands that will be restored in this coastal ecosystem. So all 3 of these phases together with all this amazing research, it costs about $12 million. And as I finish up here, I'll show you a short video of our progress on phase 2. There we go. So to wrap up, our problem was degraded marsh due to diking and draining. We added approximately 3 feet of soil to raise the marsh plain to a level that we believe is sustainable with moderate sea level rise. After monitoring it for 3 years, we feel confident that the marsh is not dropping more than expected and vegetation is taking root, so to speak. And this shows we're on track to meet our restoration goals and have made significant and measurable improvements to the Elkhorn Slough ecosystem. All right, and I have a slide here on our funders, which are a project like this really takes a broad base of support, and it would not have been possible without funding from each of these agencies that are really committed to coastal restoration. And yeah, so there you go.
Hey, awesome, Monique. It's really cool to see just the level of kind of scientific rigor you're bringing to restoration projects, right? That's not that there is no scientific kind of research in restoration, but not at that level, and so it's really impressive. So thanks for sharing that. I have one quick question to start, and then we'll get to the people with their hands raised here, and people can unmute themselves. I know a lot of the degradation and impacts of Elkhorn Slough have been mostly, if I'm not mistaken, from kind of the nearby agriculture, a lot of the kind of fertilizers and pesticide runoff, and then of course, obviously the irrigation, like you said, all the dikes and irrigation channels, that most of it for agriculture. How has your relationship with the agricultural community kind of evolved over time, and where do you see the points of kind of constructive working together, and where are still kind of some, where you're at odds, where you still think there's some tension?
That's a really excellent question. It's not really my forte. That's not the area that I work in. We have folks that are really focused. The Elkhorn Slough Foundation has been working really tirelessly on that interface between farmers and the slough, and focusing on just, I think it's understanding how that is really impacting it. So you mentioned that a lot of the diking and draining was agriculture, but not necessarily. A lot of it was, some of it was rangeland. We had a big dairy out here. So it's really a broad base. And it was under that concept that historically land needed to be reclaimed. So wetland was not understood as being valuable. And so it needed to be reclaimed. And so it's just a different mindset. And I think that, and so a lot of what the Tidal Wetland program is focused on is reversing that, which is not really agricultural focused in that sense. And so in terms of that relationship, we do have, the coastal training program works a lot with farmers. Elkhorn Slough Foundation does, and it's a matter of understanding what each side needs and having that conversation and finding common ground.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that context is really important because, again, we're in my classes, we're talking about kind of these paradigms that are shifting. And you're right that, wetlands was looked at as kind of swamp, right? It was bugs and kind of, it was never dry and, it was bad for development. And so it was like reclaiming it for human use, right? That was the paradigm, and very different from 2021, no doubt. Great. So let's go. I think Lori, you had your hand up there. If you want to unmute yourself. Oh, I guess you put it in the chat there. Do you want to just ask it, or do you want us to just read it from the chat? All right, I will just read it there. Is there any chance some of the new marsh area could be set aside as wildlife refuge for otters, seals, seabirds, where the ever-growing masses of people on kayaks and watercraft will not be allowed to go?
Yes, it's a really interesting question. So we were just having that conversation the other day, and we're ordering signs right now to actually restrict access for kayakers going into that area, so that more, yeah, it's a really good question. I think Lillian Carswell from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is actually working on looking at that and trying to understand better the relationship between, we want everybody out there. We want everybody out there to look at what the otters are, to understand it, to appreciate it, and to protect it. But what's the carrying capacity of visitors coming to the slough? And we really don't have that question yet. We know from Charles's study that people are willing to come and pay to see the otters, but yeah, how do you protect them and how do you keep that area? They need to have, there's certain requirements they need, and one of them is that it seems like they need that channel that opens at, so you can see it. Oh, it's on this side on mine, where it's open on both ends, so that they have a way out if they want to. And that's what we created in this new marsh area. And I think, well, actually, yeah, I didn't mention that. So in phase 2, when we opened those channels up, it was the very next tide, the very next incoming tide, 2 otters came from Yampa and went around and explored that area. And that was pretty cool. It's pretty cool to see that.
Wow. Yeah, that was quick. All right. Well, Lori is happy about that. So, all right, great. Let's open it up here to other people. Feel free to unmute yourself, or if you'd like, I can just read or from the chat. So I have some other questions, but I'd like to open it up to the audience here. So it looks like Ben's got a question. Go for it, Ben. Let's see. I changed it so you should be able to unmute. You want to write it in? We could get somebody else here. Let's see, Peter. I don't know what the tech difficulties are here, because again, you should be able to unmute yourselves. Cannot unmute. Weird. Sorry about that. I've changed the setting and it says allow. Let me see. I'll go there again. Try that.
Okay, here we go. Yep. Now
All
I can
right,
unmute.
sorry about that. Sorry, Ben. We'll come back to you, Ben. Sorry about that after that. Yeah. Go for it, Peter.
I have a question first. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very, very fascinating, and something that I think probably a lot of us have not heard of being done. So that's just really, really great to hear. My question is about scalability. What are you all thinking about in terms of trying to see where this can be applied in other places? Is that a thing that you all are hoping to replicate with this same team? Or is it something that you are hoping to demonstrate with your academic findings and research and spread to other groups that are working in places and then let them assess if that area is a place for these kinds of interventions?
So we're focused primarily in Elkhorn Slough, and there are other areas in Elkhorn Slough where this could be useful. And because Elkhorn Slough is such a small system, it's really, we can tackle it from all different angles, and we can really make measurable impacts, which we really like. In terms of scalability, I think it depends. As you heard, it's very expensive. So it depends on what your end goal is and what your system is like. So if you want to try and scale this to, say, sequester a lot of carbon, this may not be the most cost-effective way of doing that. But if you want to do it to create habitat, there are some really key areas that you can restore that will have a big impact on restoring habitat and make a big difference. So it depends on, I think, what your focus is. And there are people doing this up and down the coast. There are people doing this all over the country, on all the coasts. This is restoring these wetlands. A lot of areas are a little bit different from Elkhorn Slough in that they have a sediment source. So oftentimes you, like in San Francisco Bay, you open up the area, you recontour it a little bit, but you might not have to bring in a lot of sediment. Now the sediment sources coming down from the Sacramento are lower than they used to be, but there is still quite a big sediment source in San Francisco Bay that can help build those marshes naturally. We don't have that in Elkhorn Slough, so we have to move more soil to get to it. So this is we've been filling, as humans, we've been filling wetlands for a really long time. We know how to do that. This is just filling them not high enough so that you to put a building on it. But in terms of scalability, again, it depends on where you do it and what you're doing and what your habitat looks like.
Great. Yeah, sorry, Ben, that you were muted there. I see you brought your question, and it's just how can people get involved and volunteer on the restoration days?
I would say either contact me or Ariel at the Elkhorn Slough. There's a website on the website, theelkhornslough.org. But you can, the easiest thing is just to send me an email and I can connect you up to the right person, given what you're interested in, because we have all sorts of volunteer opportunities. There are folks that can help, again, planting with on the restoration. We'll have some planting days coming up, but also we do bird surveys. We do educational stuff. So there's a whole range of volunteer opportunities at the slough.
Great. All right. Well, we'll make sure that people contact you directly if they're interested in that. Other questions here from anybody? And again, now everyone should be able to unmute. Sorry again about that. Maybe, I will ask another question and see if while people think here. Monique, what's the kind of the grand vision here for kind of maybe not the end point of restoration, but maybe over let's say the next 50 years, what would be your vision of what the slough would kind of achieve and then reach some kind of equilibrium or stasis where you think it was a kind of a completed project within a reasonable time frame?
So let's see. There's so many different visions dancing around in my head right now. It's hard to pick just one. We have been focused on our next project. We're starting to focus on that. It's a project a little bit further up in the slough called North Marsh. We'd like to do restoration there. What's tricky about that is it has a railroad on one side and the county road is on the other side. And it's this diked and drained and degraded marsh. But in general, what we're looking at in the slough is improving water quality. So opening up muted tidal areas, filling where we need to fill if we can, if it can be just opened up and still provide good habitat and have more water, better water quality. That's the goal. The goal is also an important thing when we talk about restoration is that we're not trying to restore the estuary to any point in time. What we're trying to do is to bump it into being more self-sustaining. So allowing those processes like the sediment accumulation for marsh buildup and sea level rise, allowing those processes or push starting those processes so that they can happen, so that we're not always tweaking the system, that we're just kind of bumping it into being a little bit more self-sustaining and having those natural processes occurring, and also allowing for space for marsh migration as sea level rises.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so I guess maybe my final question then would be, you've had a lot of experience working, in this system. It's obviously quite resilient, as as the photos and the images show how quickly things kind of, come back when you do restore. And so I just want to, what's the biggest kind of surprise you have seen in your career here in terms of, kind of nature's resilience, something that maybe was unexpected?
I was completely blown away that those otters came in on the very first tide. They had to go through like 2 kilometers of tidal channels. How did they even know? I mean, I was completely blown away that they came in with that next tide. And I think, and there's certain things. What's interesting is I find that there's things that are unexpected, but when you look back on them, you're like, oh yes, of course that would happen. And so like the fish, when we started sampling fish in the tidal channels and we were getting these lots of fish in the very beginning, and then we look at what they are, well, okay, so these are top smelt and sand dabs and things like that are fast moving, and they can move in and out with tide. So if the water gets bad, if their DO crashes, the dissolved oxygen crashes, they can get out of there. It wasn't until after about a year or so after the restoration that we started to see some of those more resident estuarine fish like staghorn sculpins and aerogobies that can burrow in the mud when the tide's out, so they can survive in the mud. And so yes, of course you could say, yeah, that's going to happen, but I think we hadn't anticipated that when we first started the project.
Wow. And so otters have a sixth sense, and we'll have to figure out how they navigate that.
Right.
Yeah, great. Well, any final questions here from Monique before we wrap this up? All right. Well, Monique, I know we'll try to do something maybe in the spring when it's a little longer days and nicer weather, or even though it has been quite nice now, but where it's a little more guaranteed nicer weather, to come and visit you in person. And
that'd be great.
And get a tour. I think we're absolutely, we're going to do that maybe April, something like that. So so thanks for all your work. It's a good success story, and in this day and age when a lot of stuff is burning down and being bulldozed, it's kind of nice to see something going the opposite direction. So thanks so much for all you're doing for this ecosystem. And everybody have a great rest of the evening, and let's give Monique a virtual round of applause here.
Thank you so much.
Right on. All right. Be well, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.